So I'm an ecologist turned social scientist, and I was born in Croydon, London Borough of Croydon, which, like many urban areas, is a mosaic of built environment, formal and informal green space, influenced by a whole variety of human uses, past and present. And I learned to identify plants, playing and growing up in these formal industrial sites and former gravel pits with very interesting flora, which I busily recorded in my Wildflower Society journal. I was the second youngest member in the Wildflower Society at the age of 8. And I now live in a place known as Devon, a long way away. And I live close to the rebel botanists of Plymouth, who, this has come up a couple of times, this idea of drawing attention to plants by chalking the names on the pavements. Really lovely idea that's kind of taken off. During the pandemic, it really became a very popular activity, didn't it? And they don't just draw attention to plants, they also draw attention to the broader ecological crisis with statements like this: 97% of wildflower meadows have been eradicated. We can all do something. No cuts, no toxins. Let life live. So a very rousing statement. But unfortunately, as you know, not everybody is so excited about plants as we are. And a large part of my research has focused on plant blindness, this phenomenon, plant blindness, which is a now well-documented area of research. Plant blindness is a lack of appreciation, attention, or negative attitudes towards plants in urban societies. It's very specific to urban, developed, industrialized societies. And the term was introduced by 2 American researchers 25 years ago. And since then, it's been kind of explored in many ways, changed to plant awareness disparity, because of the ableist connotations of plant blindness. But that's a bit of an odd term as well. So we now just tend to talk of plant awareness and a lack of plant awareness. And the focus in research has shifted very much from kind of documenting the problem, as it were, to exploring ways that we can foster plant awareness, positive attitudes, interest, and attention towards plants. And that's what my research has very much focused on. And we had a study last year that showed that the key issue in plant blindness is the decline in regular and meaningful interactions with plants. So this is the key problem in urban societies. This is disconnect from our flora, and just not having that experience that, of course, was so much a part of daily life in when we were resource-dependent societies. So I'm going to share with you some posts from Twitter now to kind of look into some of those negative perceptions towards urban plants and where those are coming from. So we've got here on the left this Canadian fleabane. Who do I report, or as we discovered yesterday, not necessarily Canadian fleabane, but one of the other species possibly. Who do I report this to, please? Weeds growing into the pavement. And then on the right, we've got, went to see my sister today, just across the road. There are some massive weeds. Next time the council are in the area, may be worth them spraying some weed killer. So these are at the absolute polar opposite of the kind of affinities with plants that we all have in this room. And we have this idea of plants just as anonymous weeds. So we've got this magnificent buddleia and the Canadian fleabane, just anonymously expressed, described as weeds. urban wild plants growing where they're not wanted. That's the definition of a weed. And sadly, we see a lot more of these emotions and perceptions using the term weeds, plants just being, not having an identity. This is a very characteristic attribute of plant blindness, is plants don't have an identity. They're just this kind of anonymous, amorphous group called plants or weeds. People aren't seeing the individual species and taxa that, you know, are kind of happening before their eyes. So weeds which undermine and crack paving, damaging footways, damaging paths and roads, plain ugly too. So there we see a very big difference in perception in terms of aesthetics. Overgrown grass, weeds, rubbish, etc. So this idea of weeds as being damaging to people, damaging to built infrastructure, and kind of symbols of neglect. These are the kind of perceptions being expressed here. This is there's no getting away from the fact that some plants do contribute to processes of mechanical and chemical weathering, to built structures. So this is a lovely colony of red valerian and ivy that used to grow on the wall around the corner from my house, which sadly was cleared just a couple of weeks ago. And you can see, you know, that there is kind of evidence where plants have been kind of accelerating that weathering process going on in that wall. But as we learnt in one of the earlier talks, it is very specific to the type of plants, and the smaller herbaceous plants aren't as guilty of this as some of the those with secondary thickening. Fortunately, a study, a couple of studies actually, have shown that the majority do prefer pavements with vegetation, so they prefer vegetated pavements to non-vegetated pavements, even if that means spontaneous vegetation. So people would rather have wild vegetation on the pavements than no vegetation at all. So that's very encouraging. But what people particularly value is some visible signs of management or kind of intentional design kind of accompanying those wild plants. So that kind of sense of control, I think that people like to have. So that's kind of something to be aware of, really. And this is some Mexican fleabane growing alongside the railway bridge just around the corner from my house. And I think this is really interesting because this, of course, is self-seeded, but looks like an intentional design feature. It's really very attractive. And these are the kind of features that people were saying they preferred in this study by Bonthu et al. The wild flowers seeded in the foot of a wall or meadow strips on the pavement. These kind of small design features were what people particularly favoured. And what was quite interesting was people were far more willing to accept and embrace spontaneous vegetation on a larger scale. So, for example, an entire brownfield site, a former industrial site, people were quite open to those becoming vegetated, whereas they had far less tolerance for vegetation on the street. So at this street scale, at this smaller scale, people were kind of less supportive than at the kind of larger scale. So that was quite interesting. And we're seeing some very exciting depaving projects developing in our urban areas where there's kind of intentional depaving going on. So this was a area of redundant pavement in a part of London, in Hackney, where the council actually recognised that paved area didn't need to be paved. They removed the paving and it developed into this wonderful wild area. And I've been having some interesting conversations with one of the people that lives at this on this social housing estate about kind of people's reactions to that project, which I can share later if you like. And then on the right we have, if I press the right button, we have a traffic calming scheme in the United States where, again, there's intentional depaving going on and vegetation allowed to return to some of those formerly paved areas. So very exciting. And so that's our pavements, but what about the kind of vast swathes of sterile amenity grassland? What do we do about those? And this, of course, is where No Mow May comes in, Plant Life's very successful initiative. And the benefits of reduced mowing are indisputable. Of course, ideally, it's better to reduce mowing for a longer period of time to optimise the benefits, or to just mow in certain areas, to have those refugia for biodiversity to go to when the mowing happens. And here are some far more positive posts on Twitter, people sharing the kind of discoveries, the plants and insects that are kind of coming into their gardens as a result of the reduced mowing, which is really lovely. But sadly, brace yourselves, because now I'm going to present the negative side, and you're going to see that there's 3 categories of negative perceptions that we're seeing to No Mow May and reduced mowing schemes in cities. So first we have this idea of harmful biodiversity, that by reducing the mowing, we're attracting undesirable biodiversity. So we have the first one, No Mow May equals Lyme disease June, ? I'm sure they were very happy with that little joke. Ealing Council, thanks to the fact you hardly mow, dog is currently being sedated in vets to remove a grass seed from his ear. So this is the issue that when you let certain grasses flower, particularly false barley and a couple of the foxtail species, you get grass seeds lodging in dogs, just some dogs' feet and ears. It kind of depends on how dangly their ears are and things like that. I went for No Mow May. Now my garden is so wild, I'm frightened to go down there in case there are snakes. So that's a more unusual reaction to No Mow May, I think you'll agree. And of course, most of us would be very excited to have grass snakes or slow worms coming into our garden as a result of reduced mowing. But if you're unused to nature, if you're very fearful about nature, or have a phobia about snakes, these are kind of some of the reactions you might get. And then we have safety concerns. So this is to do with the physical structure of the grass. So this is not to do with biodiversity now. This is just the physical structure of long grass. Grass so long, can't see vehicles coming from the Lewis direction. A fire in Brighton started in long, dry grass that the council didn't mow. Great for hiding hypodermic needles, I found. People have now dumped rubbish in the long grass, which is also full of dog feces. So kind of concerns around safety, concerns around long grass concealing antisocial waste and behaviour. And we used to see similar reactions to urban woodland. This was very common. I'll never forget when I was still growing up in Croydon, and I volunteered for the BTCV, the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers. And I remember the first project that I was helping with was this woodland being created on an area of grassland on a housing estate. And we said, you know, what do the local residents think of this lovely woodland we're creating? And the officer said, oh, they hate it. They're terrified it's going to kind of attract antisocial behaviour and they're really against it. And I thought that was kind of odd that they didn't support it and yet they were kind of getting it whether they liked it or not. So fortunately, people are a lot more accepting of trees and woodland now in cities, so you don't see that kind of fear so much now. And then we've got the kind of idea that grass should be a functional, you know, amenity area, and that if we don't mow it, that's interfering with that. So grass so long that pupils from the high school have to walk on road. Children wading through the long grass on their way home from school. Too long for children to play ball games. Some parts are nearly 2 foot long. And then we've got the kind of perceptions that it's not attractive, that the people not appreciating the aesthetics. Long grass looks untidy, bottom of North Road, complete jungle. So that's kind of some of the perceptions of No Mow May. But fortunately, if we look at the literature where we've got, kind of more controlled sample sizes, we fortunately see that a majority do not have a problem with reduced mowing, that it's not affecting their enjoyment of the green space. They may not be fully supportive, but they certainly aren't unsupportive. So that's really encouraging. And actually, park users were more accepting of long grass than non-users. So this suggests that it's not that the most vocal opponents aren't necessarily those that are most affected, and that's quite common with these changes to the built environment, to the urban environment, is that those that kind of shout the loudest aren't necessarily those that have the right to shout the loudest, as it were. So that's interesting. And what a lot of studies have shown, which is a really important point, is that support for spontaneous vegetation and informal green space is related to people's level of nature connectedness. So this is a measure of a person's affinity in nature. It's an area of research that has just absolutely exploded in the last few years. It's an area of research called eco-psychology. There's a lot of interest in it because there's very proven health and well-being benefits of nature connectedness, as well as, of course, the environmental benefits. So this is really important. The support for spontaneous vegetation is related to people's level of nature connectedness. And that's just a few of the studies that have produced evidence to support that statement. And what the research also shows is that nature connectedness is positively associated with pro-environmental behaviour. Although, to be honest, I don't think the research has really teased out a cause and effect relationship. So it's more just that they are very associated with each other. And what we do see is that low nature connectedness is also associated with some of these kind of anti-wildlife gardening behaviours, like excessive, just any use of herbicides and pesticides in gardens, and of course the increase in synthetic lawns. So these are very much kind of associated with low environmental awareness and low nature connectedness. So that's kind of people's internal makeup, as it were. That's how their kind of innate factors or cultural factors are contributing to perceptions. But it's also very context-specific, and that's what I'm going to come on to next, is thinking about the contexts that are encouraging or discouraging support for wild urban plants. And what we see is that the type of vegetation strongly influences perceptions. And we see negative perceptions are most commonly associated with tall vegetation, particularly uniformly tall grass, and particularly when there is a lack of colourful flowers, a lack of visible colour. And there's a number of studies that back that up. And incredibly, there was even a study that showed when the vegetation increased from 60 to 120 centimetres, so not a huge height increase, but there we go, then the public support, the positive perceptions would rapidly decline. So it was really as specific as a 50 centimetre increase would quite strongly affect perceptions. However, if you then introduced flowers into that tall vegetation, then public tolerance would go up. So the minute there were flowers in the tall vegetation, so kind of tall herb community, rather than just uniform grass, then public support was good. And there were some other interesting trends emerging from some of these studies. So, for example, another factor important in support was structural diversity. So diversity in the heights of vegetation, in the kind of textures or densities, that help to contribute to positive perceptions. And something else that's really interesting is people's childhood experiences of plants in cities, and that people would be far more supportive of spontaneous vegetation if it evoked childhood memories. So these plants that many of us will remember from our childhood, like ribwort plantain, a large bindweed, which I will talk about later, that we had kind of interesting experiences with. And sadly, of course, it's these experiences that are rapidly diminishing. So really important, childhood experience with plants. And sadly, this perception that wildflowers should be colourful, this idea that if there isn't lots of colour, it ain't wildflowers, is kind of fueling some of this antipathy about no mow May. So this kind of captures it, this comment. We've got this typical kind of sign about we're leaving the grass to grow long for wildlife. And then somebody responds, council speak for, we're not cutting the grass. No wildflowers whatsoever, but a 5% increase in council tax. So this is a sentiment that you see occurring a lot, is this idea that these more nature-friendly policies of local authorities are actually an excuse, a kind of cost-cutting excuse. We're not getting kind of, our money's worth if the council aren't, removing all the pavement plants or cutting the grass. So, this is kind of completely ignoring that grasses are flowers, but if it's not, a lovely, visible, colourful flower, then it can't be a wildflower. And this, it's perhaps not surprising then that there's much more visible support for these annual flower planting schemes known as pictorial meadows. These mixtures of colourful native and non-native annuals, which were the brainchild of Professor Nigel Dunnett at Sheffield University. So we have here fair play to our local council for filling our verges with fabulous wildflowers. And our local council has planted 8 miles of central reservations with wildflowers, and it looks fantastic. So we have here this perception that these are natural habitats of wildflowers, but if we look a bit closer, we can see lots of non-natives there. We've got the calendula, we've got some cosmos there, some Phacelia over there, just to name a few. So people are perceiving these informal planting schemes as being native wildflowers, but of course any botanist knows that's not the case. So that's the impact of different types of vegetation on people's perceptions. What is also important in terms of the context is the surrounding environment, what is around or amongst the plants, and how does that affect people's perceptions about that spontaneous vegetation. And what we see here is that spontaneous vegetation is viewed more negatively when it's associated with urban decay and decline. So, for example, if there's piles of rubble or rubbish, or I guess the pile of vomit that we were hearing about earlier, there's going to be much more negative perceptions than if it's in a kind of more attractive context. And interestingly, perceptions of informal green spaces were far more positive, and the perceptions about vegetation were more positive if those spaces were used in a positive way, if they were being used recreationally, whereas if they were attracting crime, then unfortunately the vegetation would get kind of viewed less favourably as well. And so it's perhaps not surprising that people living in some of these very deprived urban areas where we have a lot of decay and neglect are actually more vocal opponents to this informal vegetation. And actually, this study found that people in deprived areas were more likely to prefer formal planting schemes to informal planting schemes. So, and we just have to think that if you're living in an area where it feels like you have very little control over your life or your local area, you know, you're going to have less kind of mental or emotional capacity, I suppose, for the kind of informal vegetation. You're going to want a kind of sense of control somewhere in your environment. And just to kind of look a bit deeper now at a couple of these studies that I've been citing. So here we have one in France. This was really fascinating, actually, because what they did here in these two cities, Tours and Blois, is they studied 179 wastelands, and they selected 9 per city with 3 per successional stage. So we've got down here the early successional stage, then we've got the mid-successional stage, I don't know how well you can see that, and then a late successional stage. So we've got a kind of mixture of grassland, well, I don't want to use the word wasteland because I hate that word, brownfield sites that, well, I also don't like brownfield because they're anything but brown, but what was that fallow? That was a nice expression that somebody used earlier. Fallow urban areas at different stages of succession. And they interviewed 4 residents per wasteland. So total of 18 wastelands, 4 interviews per site. And I won't go over all of this, but I'm just going to point to one really interesting one. So this was their multivariate analysis. We've got 2 axes, both starting with negative valuations or neutral valuations, move into positive. So both on the X and Y, we've got increase in positive valuation. And what we see here is that, oh, sorry, I'm pointing at the wrong one. Yeah, it's down here. What we see here is it's the mid-successional stages that were particularly popular. So positive valuations for the intermediate stages, but lower valuations for the early succession and the late succession. And that has been echoed in other studies. And if you think about, I don't know how well you can see these 3 little pictures at the bottom, but if you think about it, the initial stage of succession, we have a lot of ruderal species. These species are often perceived as being weedy species because they're also popping up in people's flower beds, you know, in kind of temporary habitats. So people associate them with kind of weediness. They're also growing visibly out of the built environment. They're growing out of the tarmac or concrete. So again, they're seen as kind of attacking the built infrastructure, negative perceptions. Now, as soon as they grow up a bit, and you can't see the concrete, and also you start to get a less weedy, a less ruderal ecosystem, support is positive for that. That's okay. People don't mind that. As it gets older and you start to get the area scrubbing up, you start to get scrub coming in, there's a sense it's getting out of control now. It's this sense that it's kind of taking over. You can no longer get access to it. You know, it's becoming full of brambles and thorn species and so on. That's not going to be so popular. And also, as it's getting taller, there's this perception that it's going to kind of screen antisocial behaviour. It's going to attract, you know, teenagers smoking, you know, somewhere in all of this, or people dumping rubbish, and so on. So that's kind of the rationale behind why people prefer these mid-successional stages. So that's a really interesting trend. And again, with this study, there were more positive valuations for wastelands, fallow lands with high floral and colour diversity. So we're seeing that trend emerging again. Am I doing on time? Is that 25 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Oh, great, that's all right. I'm not going to cut these slides in that case. So this is another study. This was in the States this time, Detroit and Flint in Midwest, where my husband hails from. This was looking at all informal green space in a 1 kilometre area of these urban centres. And this time, this was a photo-based online survey. So I forgot to say, actually, the last studies, they were actually interviewing people on site. So that was really interesting, was you know, they were actually physically standing in these sites, interviewing people, kind of looking around and capturing perceptions.
Bethan, can you finish in 5 minutes?
I can, yeah, sure.
5 minutes question.
Yeah. So we've got here photo-based survey, people's perceptions of these different urban sites. And what they also did was do some species diversity indices. They did some vegetation surveys. And we've got here the dark green is the actual plant diversity using Simpson's index. And then we've got the perceived the perceived plant diversity in the light green, and then in the blue we've got people's preference. And the first thing you see for all these urban informal green spaces is that the perceived diversity is much lower than the actual. People aren't appreciating that these, kind of are actually quite high diversity sites, some of them. There's also a positive correlation between the perceived diversity and preference. So if people like the site, they perceive it as being high in diversity. And what they like is where it looks a well-maintained area. If there's signs of urban decay, they don't like it, and they're more likely to say it's low diversity. So interesting relationships there between kind of urban decay and people's perceptions of what's high diversity and not high diversity. And it's important to highlight that some studies have explored the fact that it's about different green spaces for different purposes. That, okay, you've got, some of these communities that are saying they prefer formal vegetation because it gives them a sense of safety, tranquility, sense of being in control, or that somebody's, in control of the environment. But then there's other types of people that favour the informal vegetation, particularly children. And this provides a much stronger sense of place, a much stronger sense of identity, and sense of freedom, sense of adventure. So, that's recognised as well, that it's about different spaces for different functions. But what is really strongly kind of evident is that people are far more supportive of spontaneous vegetation if there's some sign of kind of visible management, even if that's just, mowing paths through the vegetation. It's those kind of signs of intentional design or management in association with that. And this management really needs to balance these ecological and social considerations. It really does need to think about people, because obviously if you don't have people support, then that's not going to persist into the future. So those kind of community consultations to identify that roadside verge that is used as a shortcut to the bus stop, or that green space that is being used informally for ball games. These are the kind of green space uses it's really important to know about when we're planning these habitat creation measures. And also really important is something called biophilic design, which is very much what our last presentation was about, which is these fostering connections between humans and nature. I was just going to mention there's been some good schemes training grounds maintenance teams in grassland management and mowing regimes and so on, to kind of encourage a more floral, rich environment. And some of these management features that kind of can be really popular, things like sculptures. What I like about this idea of sculptures is you're not just creating some nice dead wood habitats in the long term, but you're also drawing attention to the kind of biodiversity that your habitat creation is going to attract. So the kind of very charismatic wildlife like owls and hedgehogs, these are the kind of some of the many benefits of long grass that it's really valuable for people to know about. And I really like this idea, promoting spaces for people to pause and reflect and engage with nature. That's a really valuable design feature in a green space, is opportunities for people to have those meaningful experiences in nature. That's fostering that nature connectedness that at the end is what we need most for public support spontaneous vegetation. And not surprisingly, the research therefore shows that people are far more supportive of spontaneous vegetation if they understand the benefits. And this study showed that even in winter, when the vegetation is not at its most attractive, support continued because there was a kind of good understanding of, you know, the rationale for managing it in that way. And this is what my current postdoc has very much focused on, is this education. So we do a lot of work with teachers, particularly about ways of inspiring children about plants. And I will be sharing these presentations, I imagine, so you can get those links later. So that's just a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the perceptions of plants in urban areas and how polarised they are, that we have these kind of extremes of high support, you know, the kind of necessity of more sustainable management for climate emergency, kind of contrasting with, you know, these less nature-connected people that kind of, you know, perceive wild vegetation as kind of being untidy or unattractive. And we have these negative perceptions with fears about undesirable biodiversity or a sense of neglect or kind of around safety and public access. And it's really important to highlight that it's not just about these concerns, but it's also about the type of vegetation, where it's located, how it's managed. So there are ways that we can kind of promote spontaneous vegetation that people will, you know, kind of get behind more easily. I won't talk about that. But this is just kind of some of the ways that we have kind of fostered plant awareness in our research studies, through memorable experiences, and also through plant foraging. So this is very much around those meaningful experiences of plants and how we can foster those in children and adults as well. And so thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you as well to all the people that gave me permission to reuse their Twitter posts.
Okay.